There's a number you've probably thought about before: how much you need to retire. You might have guessed a number, tried to calculate it, then closed the tab because the math felt overwhelming and the timeline felt tight. So instead, you just save what feels right and assume you'll figure it out later. And that's exactly how people end up decades into saving, and still get it wrong. Because if your number is off, even by a little, the consequences are brutal. Aim too low and you hit your 70s or 80s and realize you can't afford to stop working. Aim too high and you spend your entire career oversaving, giving up time, flexibility, and experiences you never get back. In this video, I'm going to show you how to actually calculate your retirement number, and why most of the advice people follow leads them to the wrong target. So you can set a number that's accurate, build a plan that actually works, and avoid spending the next 30 years aiming at the wrong goal. You've probably heard the rule: save 25 times your annual expenses. Withdraw 4% per year. Run the math, hit the target, retire comfortably. Simple. This is called the 4% rule. And it's been the bedrock of retirement planning since a financial researcher named William Bengen published it in 1994. He analyzed historical market data going back to 1926 and concluded that if you withdrew 4% of your portfolio in year one of retirement, then adjusted that number for inflation each subsequent year, your money would survive at least 30 years in virtually every market scenario he tested. For 3 decades, financial planners have built retirement calculations on top of this single finding. And here's the thing: for 1994, it was genuinely groundbreaking work. The problem is that 1994 was a different world. Interest rates were higher, bond yields were higher, inflation, for most of that historical window, was more predictable. Life expectancy tables looked different, and nobody was planning for a retirement that might last 35 or 40 years because most people weren't living that long in retirement. In 2021, researchers at Morningstar ran a new analysis using current market conditions, lower expected bond returns, and contemporary life expectancy data. Their finding: for a 30-year retirement starting today, a 3.3% withdrawal rate is more appropriate than 4%. That sounds like a rounding error. It is not. If you need $60,000 a year to live comfortably in retirement, the 4% rule says you need $1.5 million. The updated 3.3% figure says you need $1.8 million. That's a $300,000 gap, built entirely on an outdated assumption. That's the kind of miscalculation that shows up quietly for 15 years of retirement and then becomes impossible to fix. But here's where it gets interesting, because the withdrawal rate is only half the problem. The other half is the number you're multiplying, your annual expenses. And that number, most people dramatically underestimate it. Here's a belief that gets repeated so often it feels like fact: you'll spend less in retirement than you do now. The logic goes something like this: no more commuting costs, no more work clothes, the kids are out of the house. The mortgage might be paid off. Your expenses will naturally shrink, so you only need to replace 70 to 80% of your pre-retirement income. Researchers call this the replacement rate assumption. Financial advisors have been using it for decades. It is often wrong. A 2018 study from the Journal of Financial Planning tracked actual retiree spending over a 20-year period and found something the conventional model didn't predict. Spending does not decline steadily in retirement. It front-loads. In the first decade of retirement, people often spend as much or more than they did while working. They travel. They renovate. They spend time with grandchildren. They do all the things they told themselves they'd do when they retired. Spending typically starts declining in the mid-70s and drops more sharply in the 80s. But by then, healthcare costs are rising fast enough to absorb much of what lifestyle spending was releasing. The net result? The 70% to 80% replacement rate is a statistical average that masks enormous variation. If you retire healthy at 62 with a bucket list and no major debt, your first decade of retirement might cost 100% or more of your working income. The 70% number only becomes true if you're not actually doing much. And then there's the thing nobody puts in the retirement brochure: healthcare. A 2023 analysis from Fidelity Investments estimated that the average couple retiring at 65 will spend approximately $315,000 on healthcare costs over the course of retirement. Out of pocket. That's after Medicare. That figure has increased 70% over the past decade, and there is no credible projection that suggests it slows down. If your retirement budget doesn't include a serious healthcare line item, your budget is fiction. So let's start building the real number. Most retirement calculators ask you to input a single annual expense figure, multiply it out, and spit back a target. That approach is too blunt. Your retirement isn't a flat line. It's a shape. And understanding the shape is what makes the difference between a number that actually works and one that looks right until it doesn't. Here's how to think about it. Retirement spending researchers at JP Morgan Asset Management describe what they call the retirement spending smile. Spending is highest in the early years, the go-go years when you're active, healthy, and finally have time. It dips in the middle, the slow-go years, as travel slows and lifestyle settles. Then it rises again in the late years, the no-go years, driven almost entirely by healthcare and long-term care needs. The average retirement lasts longer than most people assume. If you're 65 today, the Social Security Administration estimates a 25% chance you'll live past 90. That's a 25-year retirement. If you retire at 62, that window pushes past 30 years. And if you're married, the odds that at least one of you lives into your late 80s are higher than 50%. So when you're building your number, you need to think in 3 phases. Phase 1, early retirement, ages 62 to 75 roughly. This is typically your highest spending decade. Budget realistically, not optimistically. What does your actual lifestyle cost? Not the stripped-down version you'd manage on if you had to, but the life you've been working toward? For most people in comfortable middle-class households, this number lands somewhere between $60,000 and $100,000 per year in today's dollars. Some higher, some lower. But the 70% assumption usually undershoots it. Phase 2. Mid-retirement, ages 75 to 85. Spending often moderates here. You might travel less. Your housing is settled. This is where the 70 to 80% figure gets closest to reality. But it's also when routine healthcare costs start compounding. Phase 3. Late retirement, ages 85 plus. Long-term care becomes the dominant variable. According to the Genworth Cost of Care Survey, the median annual cost of a private room in a nursing facility in 2023 was approximately $108,405. Home health aid care runs roughly $61,776 annually. These numbers are not fringe scenarios. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services estimates that about 70% of people turning 65 today will need some form of long-term care at some point in their lives. Now, here's what this means for your number. If you want $70,000 per year in retirement income starting at age 65, and you plan for a 30-year retirement, and you account for 2.5% average inflation, and you're using a 3.3% safe withdrawal rate, and you build in a long-term care buffer of approximately $250,000 to $350,000 depending on your situation, the math doesn't land at $1 million. It lands somewhere between $2.1 million and $2.6 million in invested assets, depending on Social Security income, pension income, and lifestyle specifics. That number might be alarming. Or it might be closer to what you've already been hearing. But here's what matters most. Your number is specific to you, not to a generic calculator built on assumptions from a different era. And there's a factor we haven't talked about yet, one that changes the math more than almost anything else. You know what inflation does to prices. You've watched it happen. Groceries, housing, insurance, utilities. The cost of a comfortable life has risen sharply, and every financial projection you build today has to account for a future where that cost is higher still. But here's the paradox nobody explains clearly. Standard retirement advice tells you to plan for 2 to 3% inflation. That's the Federal Reserve's target. That's the number baked into most retirement calculators. And for broad consumer prices, it's a reasonable long-run assumption. The problem is that retirees don't experience average inflation. They experience retiree inflation. And retiree inflation, driven by healthcare, housing, and long-term care, has historically run 1 to 2 percentage points higher than the general CPI. A 2021 study published in Health Affairs found that out-of-pocket healthcare spending for older Americans increased at roughly twice the rate of general inflation over the preceding decade. That gap compounds over a 30-year retirement into a significantly larger number than most plans account for. Here's what this looks like in practice. If your plan assumes 2.5% inflation and actual retiree inflation runs at 4%, a $70,000 annual lifestyle in today's dollars costs approximately $152,000 in 25 years instead of the $127,000 your plan projected. That $25,000 annual gap, sustained over a decade, is $250,000 you didn't plan for. This is the part of retirement planning that breaks quietly, not all at once. You don't notice it in year 3 or year 5. You notice it in year 18 when your portfolio is drawing down faster than projected, and the math that used to make sense no longer does. The fix is not complicated, but it requires you to use a higher inflation assumption, specifically for healthcare, than your calculator's default. Most online tools won't do this automatically. You have to do it manually or work with someone who knows to build it in. But there's something even more psychologically interesting happening underneath all of this. And it's the reason so many people end up at retirement with the wrong number, even when they tried to do everything right. Here's the thing. Most people who end up underprepared for retirement weren't lazy. They weren't reckless. They weren't indifferent to their future. They were human. Behavioral economists call it present bias. Your brain assigns dramatically more psychological weight to things happening right now than to things happening in the future. A 2015 study from Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School demonstrated that when people imagine their future selves in retirement, brain scans show neural activation patterns more similar to imagining a stranger than imagining themselves. Literally. Your 70-year-old self registers as someone else, which means saving for retirement doesn't feel like saving for you. It feels like sending money to a stranger, and your brain, which is wired for present survival, naturally resists it. This is why the number you're aiming at often gets set too low. Not because you can't do the math, but because higher numbers feel abstract and painful now, and the cost of getting it wrong feels distant and theoretical. Loss aversion, one of the most robust findings in behavioral economics, means your brain weights $1 of current consumption more heavily than $1 of future security. And there's a second psychological trap layered on top. Anchoring. Research from Tversky and Kahneman's foundational work in the 1970s, replicated dozens of times since, shows that the human brain latches onto the first number it encounters and uses it as a reference point for all subsequent estimates. Whatever number you heard first, whether it was $1 million or your company's auto-enrollment savings rate or a retirement calculator you ran 5 years ago, that number is influencing your current target whether you know it or not. This is not a character flaw. It's cognitive architecture. The same mental shortcuts that help you navigate a complex world efficiently are the ones that lead you to underestimate your retirement number, overestimate your future flexibility, and chronically delay corrections that would be easy now and difficult later. The good news, knowing the mechanism gives you a way around it. Let's bring this back to something actionable, because your retirement number is not one size fits all. It's a function of specific variables, and shifting any one of them changes the target meaningfully. The first variable is your retirement age. This one matters more than almost any other factor, and in 2 directions at once. The earlier you retire, the longer your money has to last. But also, the fewer years your investments have to compound, the shorter your contribution window, and potentially the smaller your Social Security benefit. Research from Stanford's Center on Longevity found that delaying Social Security from age 62 to age 70 increases your monthly benefit by approximately 76%. That's not a minor adjustment. For a couple, coordinating Social Security claiming strategy alone can be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in lifetime income. The second variable is your spending identity. Not what you think you'll spend. What you actually spend. If you've never tracked your monthly outflows with real precision, your retirement estimate is a guess wearing math's clothes. The person spending $45,000 per year has a fundamentally different number than the person spending $95,000 per year. And lifestyle creep, the gradual expansion of your standards and expectations over time, means your retirement spending will likely mirror your pre-retirement spending more closely than you expect. The third variable is income sources outside your portfolio. Social Security, pension income, rental property, part-time work you genuinely enjoy. Every dollar of guaranteed income per year reduces the portfolio you need to build by approximately $25 to $30 in invested assets, depending on your withdrawal rate. If your Social Security benefit is $28,000 per year, that's equivalent to having $700,000 to $840,000 in your portfolio working for you, without the sequence of returns risk. The fourth variable is sequence of returns risk. This one is subtle but devastating. It refers to the order in which market returns arrive relative to when you start withdrawing. A market crash in year 2 of retirement does more damage than a market crash in year 17, even if the total return over 30 years is identical. Why? Because when your portfolio drops 30% early in retirement while you're simultaneously drawing it down, the math can permanently alter your trajectory. A 2019 analysis from Vanguard showed that retirees who experienced poor early returns needed significantly more in savings at retirement than those who experienced the same average returns in a more favorable sequence. This is why the number on the day you retire matters more than the average. The fifth variable, and the one most people treat as optional, is long-term care planning. We've already looked at the costs. The question is whether you self-insure by building a larger portfolio buffer, purchase long-term care insurance, or use a hybrid life insurance product with long-term care riders. There is no universally right answer, but there is a universally wrong one, ignoring it entirely. Let's build some real-world scenarios. Scenario 1. A couple, both 65, retiring with modest but comfortable expectations. They want to travel domestically a few times a year. They have a paid-off home in a mid-cost of living area. They expect to spend around $65,000 per year in today's dollars. Combined Social Security of $42,000 annually. They need to cover $23,000 per year from their portfolio. At a 3.3% withdrawal rate, with inflation adjustments and a long-term care buffer of $300,000, they need approximately $1.0 to $1.2 million in invested assets. That is genuinely achievable for disciplined middle-income savers. But notice, they are relying heavily on Social Security, a paid-off home, and a modest lifestyle. Scenario 2. A single person, 62, retiring early with a rented home in a higher cost of living area. No pension, they want to travel internationally, stay healthy, and have flexibility. They expect to spend $85,000 per year. Social Security of $22,000 annually starting at 67. So a 5-year gap to bridge first. They need a portfolio large enough to cover $63,000 per year initially, for a retirement that could last 35 years. With inflation, a higher withdrawal rate risk, the early retirement Social Security gap, and a long-term care buffer, they need somewhere between $2.2 million and $2.8 million. That's not impossible, but it requires a plan, not a hope. Scenario 3. A couple with high spending habits, private school for grandchildren, international travel, multiple properties, higher healthcare expectations, and no desire to reduce lifestyle. Spending of $130,000 per year or more. Combined Social Security of $55,000 annually. Portfolio requirement. $2.5 million on the low end, likely $3.5 million or more with appropriate buffers. Here's what these scenarios reveal. The range is enormous, and the difference between $1 million and $3 million in required savings is not primarily about market performance. It's about when you retire, how you live, what healthcare costs you, and what income sources exist outside your portfolio. Guessing at the middle of that range isn't a strategy. It's a coin flip with 30 years of consequences. Here's something the financial industry rarely acknowledges. The number you need is not just a financial calculation. It's a psychological one. Research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2021 caused a significant stir in behavioral finance circles. The study found that emotional well-being from income does not plateau at $75,000, as earlier research had suggested. For many people, it continues rising significantly further. Financial security, specifically the feeling of safety, does not arrive at a fixed dollar amount. It's relative to your reference group, your habits, and your sense of control, which means some people will reach their number and feel anxious anyway. Not because they've miscalculated, because their brain's threat detection system, their amygdala, has been running on financial stress for so long that relief doesn't come automatically when the spreadsheet says it should. A 2022 study from the Global Financial Literacy Excellence Center found that financial anxiety persists in a significant proportion of retirees, even with objectively adequate savings. The cognitive habit of scarcity, the pattern of monitoring, worrying, and planning for shortfalls, doesn't switch off when the account balance crosses a threshold. It often has to be actively addressed. This matters because it means arriving at the right number without addressing the psychology underneath leaves you financially prepared but emotionally unprepared. And emotional unpreparedness in retirement is its own cost. People who don't transition well psychologically often spend in reactive and often destructive patterns, hoarding money they should be using or spending recklessly to prove they're not hoarding. The retirement number is necessary. It is not sufficient. Here's what I want you to take from all of this. If you looked at the numbers in this video and felt a kind of vertigo, that's not because you failed. It's because the information you were given before was incomplete. The 4% rule, useful but outdated as a precise guide. The 70% replacement rate, a statistical average that doesn't describe your life. The retirement calculator you ran 5 years ago, built on assumptions that may no longer hold. The vague $1 million figure in your head, probably not calibrated to your actual spending, your actual timeline, or the actual cost of healthcare in the 2026. None of that is your fault. You can only build toward a number you know. But now you know a better framework. Your number isn't a rule of thumb. It's a function of your retirement age, your spending, your income sources, your inflation exposure, and your plan for healthcare. Change any one of those variables significantly, and your target shifts. The households that navigate retirement successfully are not the ones who guessed right by accident. They're the ones who ran a specific, honest, updated calculation and then built systems to move toward it without leaving their present lives completely hollow in the process. Because that's the other side of this. Saving so aggressively that you sacrifice every meaningful experience in your 30s, 40s, and 50s isn't wisdom. It's a different kind of miscalculation. A 2019 study from Rand Corporation found that terminal regret in retirees is just as likely to center on experiences not taken as on money not saved. The goal is not the biggest number possible. The goal is the right number. Your number. The one that lets your retirement be what you worked for without requiring you to hollow out your present life to get there. You're not behind, you're recalibrating, and that's not the same thing. So, how much do you actually need to retire comfortably in 2026? The honest answer is, it depends on 5 things. When you retire, how you spend, what income exists outside your portfolio, how you plan for healthcare, and whether your plan accounts for retiree-specific inflation, not the headline number. For most middle-class households targeting a comfortable retirement at 65, with a realistic spending picture and a reasonable Social Security benefit, the honest number lands somewhere between $1.2 million and $2.5 million. The specific point within that range is determined by your life, not a generic formula. If you don't know your specific number yet, that's the first thing to fix. Not the investing, not the contribution rate, the number, because you cannot navigate toward a destination you haven't identified. If this gave you something to think about, drop your current retirement target in the comments. No judgment, no financial advice, just an honest conversation about a question almost nobody is getting a straight answer to. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.